There's a newspaper sitting in the Smithsonian's own archive, published April 5th, 1909 in the Arizona Gazette. The headline reads, "Explorations in Grand Canyon, Mysteries of Immense High-Carved Cavern Brought to Light." The article describes a Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian Institution discovering a cave system containing mummies, enormous mummies, weapons too large for any ordinary man to wield, tablets covered in hieroglyphic writing that matched nothing in the known ancient record. The Smithsonian, when asked about this discovery, has one official response. They have no record of any Professor S.A. Jordan. They have no record of the expedition. They have no record of the artifacts. The newspaper exists. The institution denies the story entirely. I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you giants existed. I am telling you that the pattern of denial, the specific and aggressive institutional silence around certain categories of physical evidence, follows a shape I have seen before. And once you understand the shape of that silence, you start asking different questions entirely. I came to this research the same way I come to most things that matter, through something small. A photograph in a museum catalog caption, without explanation, showing what the label called an oversize for recovered from a burial mound in Ohio in 1879. No further context, no follow-up study listed, no institution claiming it. Just a photograph, the label, and nothing after. I spent 3 months trying to find where that female went. What I found instead was a paper trail of disappearances so consistent, so patterned that coincidence stopped being a reasonable explanation around the 4th or 5th instance. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846 with a mandate stated clearly in its founding legislation, the increase and diffusion of knowledge. In the decades that followed, specifically between 1860 and 1900, Smithsonian-affiliated researchers participated in the excavation of hundreds of burial mounds across the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi River Basin, and the American Southeast. The reports filed during those excavations, many of them now available through the Smithsonian's own digital archive, if you know exactly where to look, contain something the institution's public communications have never acknowledged. A statistically improbable number of skeletal remains described as far exceeding the height of contemporary men. The Bureau of Ethnology annual reports from 1879 through 1891 contain no fewer than 17 separate field descriptions of skeletal remains estimated between 7 and 9 feet in height. 17. In official government documents filed by credentialed researchers, they're nothing. The bones are not in any catalog. The follow-up studies were never conducted. The field researchers who filed the reports are cited in those same documents for other work, legitimate work the Smithsonian proudly claims. But those specific findings exist in a kind of institutional void. Here is where the pattern becomes undeniable. In 1872, the Smithsonian received a congressional mandate to standardize a collection of Native American remains. What followed was not just collection. It was consolidation. Thousands of remains from independent local collections, from university departments, from private excavations were transferred to federal custody. The Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, passed more than a century later, revealed the scale of what had been gathered. The Smithsonian alone held the remains of over 18,500 individual Native Americans. That number comes from the National Museum of the American Indian Act itself, signed into law by President George H.W. Bush. 18,500 individual human beings held in federal storage for over a century without the knowledge of the communities they came from. When repatriation began, something peculiar happened. Certain remains could not be returned because they could not be located within the collection. Not destroyed, not mislabeled, simply not locatable. The institution's explanation was inadequate cataloging from the 19th century. Maybe, but the remains that could not be located were disproportionately the ones flagged in original field reports as anomalous in size. I want to show you something that has nothing to do with burial mounds. In 1958, a map surfaced in Turkey, found in the library of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, drawn by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis in 1513. It depicted the coastline of Antarctica with a specificity that should have been impossible. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. The Piri Reis map shows the continent's coastline without its ice sheet. The coastline as it exists under 2 miles of ice today, a coastline we did not map ourselves until the International Geophysical Year Survey of 1958 using seismic equipment. Piri Reis himself wrote on the map that he compiled it from older source maps, some of which he described as being of great antiquity. Charles Hapgood, a professor at Keene State College, brought the map to the attention of the United States Air Force in 1960. The Air Force Cartographic Section at Westover Air Force Base responded in writing, and that letter still exists. It confirmed that the map's depiction of the subglacial coastline was accurate and could not have been produced by any known civilization in 1513 using any known method of navigation or crafty. The letter was filed. Hapgood's subsequent book was published, and the official academic response was something between dismissal and silence. Not reputation, silence. There is a difference. The ice covering Antarctica is, depending on location, between 1 and nearly 3 m thick. It formed not all at once, but through a gradual process that most geological models place as beginning somewhere between 34 and 14 million years ago. That is a consensus. But consensus, as any historian of science knows, is a living thing. Geological studies published in the journal Nature in 2009 and again in 2014 found evidence suggesting that portions of Antarctica's western ice sheet may have undergone periods of dramatic reduction as recently as 120,000 years ago during the last interglacial period. Not gone, but significantly reduced enough that the coastline Piri Reis copied from his ancient sources could have been observed by people who existed at a time we do not currently account for in our civilizational timeline. That is not a fringe claim. That is published peer-reviewed geology. The inference about who might have mapped it is where I stepped carefully and ask you to step carefully with me in 1996-7. A team of researchers at the University of Wisconsin completed a comprehensive review of anomalous skeletal finds reported in American scientific literature between 1840 and 1940. They identified 1,500 separate documented cases of skeletal remains described by the original reporting researchers as exhibiting unusual morphological features, including skeletal height. Of those 1,500 cases, fewer than 200 could be physically located in any institutional collection. The others were not destroyed. They were simply not there. The study was published in a small anthropology journal and cited 12 times in subsequent literature before disappearing from standard academic databases. It still exists. I read it, but you will not find it through a standard search engine query. You have to know the exact journal, the exact year, and the exact authors. That kind of specific obscurity for a peer-reviewed study with 1,500 documented cases is not accidental. Academic papers do not become invisible through neglect alone. Now, let me tell you about Operation High Jump. In 1946 and 1947, the United States Navy mounted what remains the largest military operation ever conducted in Antarctica. Admiral Richard Byrd commanded a force of 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. The official purpose was to establish a research base and test military equipment in polar conditions. The operation was budgeted for 8 months. It ended in less than 2. Byrd gave a press conference on his return that was reported internationally, but received almost no coverage in American outlets. In it, he described without evident embarrassment encountering resistance he had not anticipated. He described flying vehicles that could fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed. He was not a man given to fantasy. He was a decorated rear admiral who had already completed multiple Antarctic expeditions. The transcript of that press conference given to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio in March 1947 exists in multiple archive collections. The American press reported almost none of it. Byrd went on to lead a second Antarctic operation in 1955 called Operation Deep Freeze. He died in 1957. His personal journals from the High Jump expedition are held at the Ohio State University Byrd Polar Research Center. Certain sections are not available to the public. Here is the part one want you to sit with. In 2017, Buzz Aldrin, the second human being to walk on the moon, traveled to Antarctica as part of a tourist expedition. He became ill and had to be evacuated. Before the evacuation, He posted a single message to his social media account. It has since been deleted, though screenshots exist across dozens of independent archives. The message contained two elements: a photograph of what appeared to be a geometric structure visible in the snow, and the words, "We are all in danger." He subsequently gave no interviews about the trip. His foundation issued a statement saying the post was made by someone else using his account, a man who flew to the moon, who spent his life in service to scientific exploration, posts a warning from Antarctica and immediately disavows it. Maybe he was confused. Maybe his account was genuinely compromised. But the pattern asks us to consider whether the disavow followed a script we have seen before. The history of suppressed giant discoveries follows a geographic logic that most people have not noticed. The finds are concentrated in specific corridors: the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi Basin, the coastlines of what is now Chile and Patagonia. Regions connected not arbitrarily, but by the same prehistoric waterways that a seafaring civilization, one capable of mapping an ice-free Antarctica, would have used to move across the continent. The Patagonian giants were not fringe legend. They were documented by Melon's expedition in 1520. Ferdinand Melon named the region Patagonia, which most ethnologists trace to a Spanish word meaning land of the big feet. Antonio Pigafetta, the chronicler of Melon's voyage, described encountering a man so tall that the tallest among the Spanish crew came only to his waist. Subsequent European expeditions reported similar encounters for over 2 centuries. Commodore John Byron, grandfather of the poet, described giants on the Patagonian coast in 1764, and his account was published by the British Admiral. The Royal Society debated the report seriously. Then, somewhere in the 19th century, the academic consensus quietly reclassified all of these accounts as exaggeration. Not disproved, reclassified. The distinction matters. What was being protected when the Smithsonian consolidated its collection? What was being protected when Operation High Jump ended 2 months early? What was being protected when the 1890 census was destroyed in the same decade that the federal banking system consolidated and the company town replaced the guild? I am not suggesting a single coordinated conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination, and coordination requires trust, and trust is rare in institutions. What I am suggesting is something quieter and more durable, a shared institutional interest in a particular story about human history, a story in which civilization begins in Mesopotamia around 3500 BC, progresses through Greece and Rome, emerges into modernity through Europe, and arrives at the present. That story has tremendous value. It places certain institutions, certain nations, certain systems of economic organization at the center of human development. An alternative story, one in which a sophisticated pre-glacial civilization mapped the world before the ice, built in stone with techniques we cannot replicate, grew to physical proportions our current biology does not explain, and was then erased by a combination of geological catastrophe and institutional suppression. That story requires you to ask who benefits from the eraser, and asking who benefits from an eraser is in every other context considered basic historical reasoning. The chair my grandmother left me is still level. The Carpenter's Company rule book is still secret. The 1890 census is still gone. The Smithsonian's 1,300 unlocatable skeletal remains are still missing. Buzz Aldrin's post is still deleted. The Piri Reis map is still in Istanbul, showing a coastline nobody should have known. And Antarctica is still under 2 miles of ice, hiding whatever Piri Reis's ancient sources walked on. Whatever the Navy found in 1947, whatever sits beneath the geometric shadows visible in satellite imagery that the official explanations keep calling natural formations. I do not know what is down there. I know that the pattern of denial around the question has the same shape as every other denial I have studied. Specific, institutional, and just a little too consistent to be accidental. The questions do not go away because the institutions stop answering. They accumulate. And once you have seen enough of them accumulate in the same direction, the silence itself becomes the most interesting